So to start with a very short technical explanation, Summer, can you describe just very briefly what the framework does, what problem it solves, and yeah, how it works and what it does?
Sure. So the whole point of the framework is to give publishers and website operators the ability to provide their users with transparency into all the companies that are collecting their personal data, and then using that to provide different services like personalized advertising or content or measurement or other types of things. The other important piece to it that we spent quite a bit of time on is the ability to transmit what we call the consent signal. So it's when a user sets their preferences, they consent to certain things. Other vendors rely on legitimate interest or different types of legal bases. But to be able to communicate that signal to all the vendors who need to have that information before they're able to set their cookies and run their code on the site. And I know if lots of you are in digital advertising, that's a very complicated thing in the daisy chain out in the ecosystem, that black box that everybody talks about. So just like OpenRTB, which we actually leveraged, we send the consent signal in a similar manner out to all the vendors and pass that information along.
So I heard you say consent, but I also heard you say legitimate interest. So Alice, as the legal expert, can you tell us, does the framework only cater for consent? Does it only accommodate a strict consent scenario?
That's a really good question, and the name would make you think that it is only about consent. But importantly, there are several goals that the framework is set out to meet. The first one is transparency. So regardless of whether you're operating on the basis of consent, that transparency to end users is important, whether you're operating on the basis of legitimate interest or on consent, so that the user knows which companies are working with data about them and for what purposes they're working with that data. Importantly, the user can make those choices. If you are operating on the basis of consent, that's great. The framework is designed to handle that. It is also designed to collect those same choices. We call it a consent signal, but it does strengthen a company's basis when operating on legitimate interest if you are able to provide those transparency and choice options to the user. So it does support both.
So it did start out life as a consent framework, but then we had 2 months of really intense conversations with publishers in March and April, and it has evolved and is continuing to evolve to accommodate the legitimate interest legal basis. Summer, can you explain from a technical point of view how it accommodates legitimate interest? Does that use the DAISY bit, or are there other tools that we're leveraging right now to address legitimate interest?
So all of the information about vendors are stored in what we call the GVL, which is the Global Vendors List. And pretty much every vendor who's registered on the list has an ID number. That ID number corresponds to a position in the consent string. So it's a very, very simple way to pass that information along so that it's tiny and small and doesn't add too much weight to the payload. Also included in the Global Vendors List are the purposes that the vendor is looking to use data for. And they can either say they're going to collect consent for it, or they can say, I'm going to rely on legitimate interest. That information is used by what we call consent management providers, who are the companies that create the front end that users will see and be able to set their consent preferences. Anybody can be a CMP, even publishers can be a CMP and build their own front end. Then once that information is saved by the user and set into the signal, the consent string is passed along, and then if companies don't get consent, they can always fall back on legitimate interest for their other purposes. They know that they have that. There is an additional piece to this.
Yes, pub vendors JSON is what I was getting at.
Yeah, so out of the many conversations that we had with publishers, One of the things that publishers have been missing and wanting for many years, just like consumers, is also transparency and choice into how companies use data that they collect from users on their sites. So we created this kind of out-of-bound communication mechanism where publishers can say in a file that they maintain, okay, I want to allow this set of vendors to collect data on through my site, and I want them to be able to use it for purpose X, Y, and Z, but I don't want data on my site to be used for this purpose. So you could say collect data, for instance, to measure activity on my site, but you couldn't take the data that you collect from my site and say put it back into your models and use that for another purpose or sell it to other providers. Just some ways to give publishers some control there.
And can you help us understand whether publishers need to disclose? If you sign up for the framework, are you signing up to disclose and work with all the vendors in the global vendor list?
No, actually the pub vendors JSON file also gives publishers the ability to basically have a whitelist. So they can say, I'm only going to work with these 10 vendors or these 20 vendors that are a subset of the global vendor list. So they don't have to work with everyone. They can pick the ones that they want to work with, and they communicate that to the CMP through that file.
And how about vendors that are not on the global vendor list? Nigel, what's the deal if you want to work with partners that for some reason have missed the chance and haven't signed up yet for the global vendor list?
Yes. So if you're a publisher, for example,
Exactly.
and you'd like to work with a vendor who's not currently listed.
Exactly.
So one of the best things about this tool is that it promotes a good level of communication. It actually is a great forcing function for this kind of communication, whereas previously vendors can be included, sometimes even downstream, without the understanding or the knowledge of the publisher. In this instance, if the publisher has someone specific they'd like to work with who's not currently on the vendor list, it's obviously no problem. It's just a process they have to go through to get in touch and to get themselves listed. There is a small cost to a vendor.
Yeah.
So vendors, as things stand today, would pay a fee of $1,200 to be included. I think that the point of that cost, because I'm sure it probably seems very low, based on the infrastructure and the management of this framework that goes on behind the scenes, is that this is not a money-making exercise. It's an exercise in moving the industry forward and creating that level of transparency. And for the record, for a publisher, there's no fee at all, which is also what makes it hard to see how many publishers are currently using the system.
Yes, that was an unforeseen shortcoming of...
Can I add one thing to that?
Go ahead. Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
I know there's a misconception by people that the vendors list is just for people in companies in ad tech. That's not the case. Anybody who's going to set a cookie, collect user data, track for analytics, for content personalization, if you're not on the vendor list, get on it.
So OneTrust you guys have created a CMP, right?
Yep.
Can you tell us how prescriptive the framework is about the UI? Does the framework tell you exactly how you have to obtain consent? How constraining is the framework with respect to that connecting tissue between the user and the publisher?
Yeah, so one of the components of a CMP is the UI for either the website, mobile web, or even a mobile app. Recently, you've released the spec for. There is in the CMP guidelines a user experience standard, and it says things like how prominent both the positive and negative case the consent or more information or no consent could be. But there is a lot of flexibility within that bound, so you don't necessarily, it's not prescriptive in saying you need a yes and no for a consent. You could choose to put more information or advanced settings, and the definition of what is prominent and how you weight those things, there's certainly room for interpretation. So there's some things that are, I think, based on a lot of the research that your team has done and the working group has done that helps the integrity of the system, because consent collected from one CMP could be used across the entire ecosystem. So I think there's a common bar that is expected everyone to follow, and then a lot of flexibility within that.
So, Alice, back to the legal perspective, who decides which legal basis or which data processing purposes will be disclosed to the user? So the user has to see all this information and make choices. Is it the vendor who signs up on the global vendor list and says, well, I want to work under legitimate interest for these purposes, I want to work under consent? Does the vendor control that, or is that something that's in the hands of the publisher or the CMP? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think about it in 3 tiers. So the vendor signs up on the global vendor list, and they set the bar at the maximum for what they're willing to do. They'll process under a certain legal basis. They check off which purposes that they potentially process data for. And then that list is exposed to the vendor that can choose to narrow the scope further. So if, let's say, MediaMath will process for analytics and the vendor does not want that, they can dial it down and say, we don't want MediaMath to do that, or we don't want to do analytics, or both. And then the 3rd tier down is the user, when they're actually presented with that choice, can further say, I actually don't want anyone to do analytics about me or MediaMath, that sort of thing.
So maybe sort of a related point is, does the framework do anything to make it possible for publishers to limit what vendors can do with the data they collect on the publisher sites?
Yeah, definitely. So a big piece of developing the framework was figuring out what publishers needed to get out of this from a compliance and transparency perspective. And this was one of the points where contractually publishers have had agreements as to which vendors can and can't work with their data. But in addition to having paperwork, publishers were looking for a technical mechanism to really enforce that. And so a portion of the framework is this vendors.json portion, which is where they can actually go in and set these specifications. I am willing to whitelist these companies and work with them. I do not want to work with these companies. These companies can do the following things with the data or can't. So they have a lot of granular control that was a really important part of developing the framework overall.
The observation is made that one sort of incidental benefit of the framework from the point of view of publishers will actually be to give them more insight into whom they're working with.
Yep.
And you have any insight to share on that? Can you confirm that that'll probably be the case?
Yeah, certainly it gives the platform to the publisher for getting this level of insight. I talked before about the idea of the framework being a forcing function for publishers to start to understand how these vendors work with their data, and of course, likewise, how they work with those vendors. Just coming out of GDPR for one moment and putting yourselves in the shoes of a publisher, I imagine a lot of you would be publishers. One of the biggest challenges that's existed in digital, certainly in programmatic, has been the fragmentation of the supply chain for a publisher. So what that means, what I'm saying is, your inventory is leaving your site, your server, if you like, and you don't know necessarily how it's being represented, how it's being presented to agencies, to DSPs. You don't know if it's being resold, if it is, who buy, under what circumstances. In some cases, it's not the fault of the publisher for being loose or not policing these things. But one of the big benefits about this legislation is that it forces publishers to get a handle on that. It closes the back doors to their inventory, which certainly in European markets is a big challenge and a big problem. You know, one of the things that publishers want is control of their supply chain. And that's one of these things that will materialize as a result of the framework. So when it comes to control, I think just the simple mechanics of how this works, it forces the publisher to take this into much bigger consideration. And when it comes to insights, again, exactly right, based on the controls that you have as a publisher and how you can actually work with the different vendors, of course, you'll have significantly better insights into how the vendors that you choose to work with are working with your data. So again, by default, publishers should have more control and more insights into all of their inventory and subsequently their supply chain as well.
Summer mentioned that, you know, it's not just for ad tech vendors, the global vendor sign up. it's not only they who might be interested in the framework, but equally agencies or even advertisers. One question we get is, we get sometimes people writing in and saying, well, I'm just a processor, so I don't think I need to use the framework. I think that's just for controllers. Is that something you'd be able to comment on, Alice? Is there any guidance it's not legal advice, disclaimer. Don't hold us to this, but is there a processor scenario as well as technically data controller scenario and relevance for the framework?
Yeah, so full disclosure, not a lawyer. I just play one on stage. We definitely get that question. I'm a processor. What does that mean? Do I need to do anything with the framework? The answer is yes. You may not want to sign up for it. You may say, it's just for controllers. That's something that your company can decide on a case-by-case basis. I think there is value, though, in processors signing up because ultimately this is about transparency with the end user. Advertisers are able to obviously get front and center with that first-party relationship. Publishers can as well. Anyone in the middle doesn't have that direct relationship. And so I think the framework is a really good opportunity to say, my company is working with that data and to give the user choices. That's one decision to make. And then separately from whether your company is actually in the list, I think it's important for you to recognize and act on the signals that are actually being passed about other companies. So even if you're processing, if you're about to take data and send it from your company to company X, if there's a consent signal there, you should be checking to see, is company X a company that the user has consented to, and decision on that accordingly.
What do we do about vendors who aren't on the global vendor list? There are about 300 companies signed up right now. That's not the whole universe. How does the system, how does a publisher work if he wants to work with vendors that are on the global vendor list, but some of whom aren't on? Does one of you want to take that?
Yeah, I can.
Have you solved that one?
Yeah, I can answer it in practice. So obviously, a lot of the vendors we're working with that have either signed up for the global vendor list, but may not have upgraded their back end to actually support that, to listen to the signals yet. And so there are a lot of publishers that come to us under this crazy time pressure saying, what do I do today and how do I comply? The obvious easiest solution is obviously to use it as a forcing function to get the vendors to add that functionality. But what a lot of the CMPs do support is a manual way to listen to some of those consent signals from the UI and manually add another line of code on their page to conditionally trigger some of those vendors. So that's, I think, really a decision for the CMP, whether they implement it or not. But a lot of them have that mix. It is more work for a publisher if the vendor doesn't support the framework, which is the challenge.
Yeah.
As an example on that one, we have a number of publishers that are working directly with DMPs. And I think we only have one DMP on the list right now. But in that case, it's up to the publisher for the data that they collect and then pass on to the DMP, Salesforce or Crux. And in that case, some of the things that we've seen our publishers doing is in the section of the CMP that covers the publisher's own purposes and collection for consent, they're actually asking or letting users know and are transparent about the companies that they work with in that kind of in that way, and then that way you cover the transparency part of it, right? Even if those folks are like processors.
Yeah. Kabir, can you explain a little bit the role of the CMP and whether a publisher can be his own CMP? Does everybody have to hire an outside CMP?
Yeah. So three main functions of the CMP. We talked about one, which is the user interface and collecting the consent from the data subject and putting that on the first party's website. The second function is taking that signal and propagating it using the standard to all the different vendors. There's a different way of doing that on mobile versus web in the standard, but they're both very easy to do. The third is, I think it's an optional recommended component in the standard, but it's keeping the record keeping on the back end that you can use to demonstrate compliance. So to demonstrate compliance in GDPR, there are a lot of different things that need to be captured that you don't necessarily need to send in the signals. So the CMP can have a back end for that as well. Anyone can be the CMP. We're seeing a lot of the publishers choosing to do it. Some publishers choosing to do it kind of experimentally to learn more about the framework and do it as a first phase. So yes, publishers can be a CMP. There's also freely available tools like the one your team has built, I believe, and commercially available tools like the one OneTrust offers as well.
And why do CMPs need to register and get an ID? So I think we have like 50 CMPs signed up right now on the system. Can you explain why they need the ID? Why do all CMPs need to sign up? They also have to pay a really tiny amount of money. But can you explain why that's necessary?
Yeah, I think there are a few reasons. The number one reason, from what I understand, is one of the capabilities of the standard is a cross-CMP, cross-domain, cross-publisher consent signal. So if on a single publisher's website the user consents to 10 vendors and 10 purposes, or the 5 purposes, another website on a completely different publisher site automatically can listen to that consent. So that has to happen at a trusted third-party level. So as part of the standard, I think it's consensu.org. There's a third party that, as part of registering with the IAB Europe, you get a subdomain that you can write a cookie to, and that's the primary reason for registering. Is there anything else you're aware of?
Yeah, there's a bunch of policies that CMPs have to follow as well, just for consistency in language and display and that sort of thing. Which goes to your point about that shared consent signal.
Exactly.
So that consent collected from yours means the same thing as when it's collected from mine. And
exactly. Yeah.
We're speaking the same language.
Yeah, I think that the auditability is really key. So it's really critical. So that's definitely a condition for legality. And I guess it can be achieved though in the different ways. Either the CMP's own back end, or actually don't know so much about the technical part on that. Nigel, how's the publisher uptake going? What can you say for us about the publisher uptake, since we can't track them as well as we'd like to?
Well, I'm sure everybody will have a take on this particular point.
Let's let everyone come in, exactly.
Publisher, obviously not working for a publisher, I can't assume to know the processes that they're going through and how publishers are prioritizing things. But that being said, it would appear that the framework and/or the method for getting consent, certainly with regards to third parties, has been one of the last things that the publishers have been getting to. I certainly would prioritize a CMP, I would imagine, actually, if I was a publisher. But the challenge with this is we don't know how many publishers are actually signing up, because, of course, there's no fee. 2 publishers have come out publicly in support of the framework. One, of course, is Axel Springer. The other was Schibsted. So actually 2 are probably the 5 largest publishers in Europe. And anecdotally, we hear that the vast majority of premium publishers in large markets are all adopting the framework. It's only anecdotally, so unfortunately what that means is that other tech vendors in the marketplace can't know and plan for and build to how to engage with that framework, because publicly only 2 companies have signed up to it. So what we found is we've got this sort of stalemate chicken and egg situation. Interoperability with other systems is one of the biggest questions. But if I was working for other tech firms that were not currently engaging in this framework, I don't know that I would build to it if I didn't know how many people were going to use it. So let me summarize that and then allow anybody else to add to it. Publicly, 2 of the largest publishers in Europe